Okay, Eight Dimensions of Mind, episode 4. Going to get into an overview of the lower dimensions of mind. So physical, emotional, conceptual, and social. And when we talk about this, when I talk about this, I'm using, as I've mentioned, a developmental stage theory to inform my definition of the lower dimensions, these lower dimensions. And so that starts, when we talk about developmental stage theory, it starts with our friend, Sigmund Freud. Now, Mr. Freud has taken, Dr. Freud has taken quite a beating in the second half of the 20th century. And maybe some of it deservedly so, but he's making a little bit of a comeback in certain areas, such as attachment. Modern attachment theory is really paying an homage to Dr. Freud. But I think part of what we need to realize is that Freud just came from the Victorian age, a very sexually repressed time. And so he was just kind of really maybe going over the top on these very taboo issues of sex. So anyhow, in his stage theory, he has a psychosexual lens. And we want to just, that's his perspective that he puts on this developmental stage model that he's presenting. So we just want to make note of that. And we've got our 5 stages here. So oral, anal, phallic, latency, and sexual. Now, those of you who are familiar with Prometheus Rising will be fairly familiar with oral and anal. Wilson gives those a pretty good treatment in that book. But in general, you know, the infant has to do with nursing and breastfeeding. So there's that aspect of it's a very oral, seeking nourishment. But if you've been around a baby, they just move through the world and they explore it with their mouth. Everything goes in their mouth. And then, you know, maybe you get the yuck face and disgust and they spit it out. Or maybe they're like, ooh, this is, you know, so is it good or is it yuck? And that's kind of their world in a way. And so it's an oral world from a Freudian perspective here. And then second stage dimension or stage, I guess we're talking here, you know, anal. When we get to the toddler, one of the things a toddler goes through is potty training, at least as a human. But, you know, animals, that's how they mark their territory with feces. So we get into this territorial thing, which Wilson covers in depth. And there's all that. And so those are, you know, kind of the 2 major stages that we get from a Freudian perspective in Prometheus Rising. And then Wilson kind of misses the boat somehow on the rest of Freud. He keeps referring to the 3rd stage as a latency, and that's actually not the case. It's the phallic stage. And in Freudian world, we talk, this is the land of the Oedipus complex. You know, the male wants to kill the father and marry the mother. Which is this very kind of rich symbolic thing, right? This concept of the Oedipus complex and phallic symbols, and again, symbology and concepts. And that's what we're advocating the 3rd stage is all about, is kind of this conceptual perspective on the world, this conceptual state of consciousness. So that really, while Wilson kind of says, you know, Freud missed the boat, actually Wilson missed Freud. And then we move on to the 4th dimension, or it's not a dimension actually, and I'll get to that, but it's a developmental stage, the latency stage. And Freud actually was a neuroscientist, and he knew that from roughly 5 years of age until puberty, there was not a lot going on neurodevelopmentally, and that's why he called it the latency stage. And later on, I'm going to try to explain that's why there's not this 5th circuit or 5th dimension. That's not anything happening neurodevelopmentally. And to a certain extent, it's an assimilation period where the child takes what it's learned in the first 5 years and tries to put it all together before moving into adulthood. And adulthood, the sexual stage, adolescence, when sexuality comes, sexual maturity comes into play, sexuality with a partner, but and all that from the Freudian lens. So I'll just stick with that for the moment. So that's kind of this quick overview of Freud. And like I said, Freud took a beating in this for being kind of out there and a lot of non-scientific approach. So after Freud became the behaviorist who took a strictly scientific approach, maybe too far, but it was just like, we're just going to go with what we could observe. And that became the basis for B.F. Skinner and behaviorism, and this ultra scientific observational approach. And what's happened then is some of the Freudian folks started applying more rigorous scientific observation to what they were working on. So along came Erik Erikson, who really took the Freud model, but looked at it instead of a psychosexual perspective, he put a psychosocial behavioral observation perspective on it. And he came up with these two dichotomies for every stage. As a side note, I'll say one, Leary loved Erikson. He mentions him in his book, The Interpersonal Diagnosis of Personality, speaks very highly of Erik Erikson. I think it was very influential on what he was doing in transactional analysis. But to go back here, Erikson, his model actually has 8 stages, but I'm just mostly concerning ourselves with the first 5 right now, because it ties to Freud. And he went on to do, after adolescence, there's kind of a young adulthood, middle adulthood, and late adulthood. So 3 more stages. And it's really, well, we'll maybe get to that later. But again, where oral for Freud was trust. Do I trust the world or I mistrust the world is kind of what Erikson's saying. Am I an autonomous little human, or am I full of shame and doubt? Do I take initiative, or do I hold myself back out of guilt? Industry, what is it I can do versus what I can't do? And then developing identity versus role confusion, to the extent that this is what's my role in the village, I develop an identity, or I have role confusion. This is kind of what they're teasing out as an adolescent. I'm going over this real quick because I'm going to move on to Gestalt, and you can't see that, but it says Gestalt in the here and now. And this is not an approach that's widely accepted in Gestalt. It was developed by my mentor, Duey Freemen, who's specific here to the Gestalt Institute of the Rockies in Colorado. It's kind of, he basically takes these Erikson stages and puts a question around them. Instead of trust versus mistrust, he says, is the world okay? Second stage, am I okay? Third stage, instead of initiative, it's how much can I do? Instead of industry, it's how well can I do it? And identity versus role confusion, and who am I? And if you look at Erikson's like 6th, 7th, and 8th stage, in some ways, it's just continuing to ask this question, who am I, as we go into young adulthood, middle adulthood, and late adulthood. But maybe the exciting thing to really note, not only these questions kind of really simplify things, and just to me, they're just wonderfully elegant in their simplicity. But when we talk about Gestalt here and now, we're talking about when a human being is in the room, he's bringing all these different parts of him, all these different states of consciousness with him. The infant state of consciousness is asking, is the world okay? The toddler is asking, am I okay? And so on. And a lot of times these, maybe one of these is coming to the forefront, or to be frank, as a therapist, we're kind of really listening to those first 2. Is the world okay? And am I okay? Therapy is a lot about those first 2. And what is the person in the room asking me in the here and now? What are they saying? If I read between the lines, what are they really saying? What is the infant really asking in this dialogue? And what is the toddler really asking? What are their needs in this dialogue? So this moves from a stage, like the infant, toddler, preschooler, to a state, like being, what is the infant? I just put babying in parentheses, walking, talking. These are kind of the main tasks that these stages are working on. But they're states of being in a way, and they're always with us, states of consciousness, and they're always playing their role in the background. And so we're just learning to read between the lines and see what is the first dimension influence or state of being of this person, and how, as a therapist in this example, how do I work with it? But I think that's important when we start talking about, that's what we're asking: dimensions of mind, states of consciousness. We're not talking about stages, but we're using those stages to inform our definition of the state or dimension. And we're using all this to take a look at that. So that, I don't know how to introduce this next portion, but I want to say that I got tuned into this book. Well, let me back up. So the next one I want to talk about is Carl Jung and his evolutionary lens. And it all comes through this book, The Origin and History of Consciousness by Erich Neumann. And if you read Carl Jung, Neumann was a student of Jung, and Jung wrote the introduction to this book. And he says, look, the pioneer can't summarize his work because he's too busy exploring the frontier. He doesn't have time to look back. He's too busy pioneering. But this book is a summary of my work. And when I read this book, it's thick and dense and kind of gross and full of Freudian jargon, and just after a while. But it really, it is the book that cemented the 8 circuits for me, the 8 dimensions for me, or especially these first 4 developmental stages. In this book, Jung is outlining, or well, Neumann as a Jungian is outlining the development of consciousness from an evolutionary perspective through the study of myth and history. So they're studying the evolution of myth, from primitive folks and their myth to modern people. And I say primitive, I mean like thousands of years ago, or hundreds of years ago, thousands, I guess. And what the myth of thousands of years ago says versus the myths of today, and using that to tease out an evolution of consciousness. And lo and behold, they come up with 4 stages in the development of consciousness. And then the second half of the book is showing how those 4 stages play out in a developing human. So that really, I guess, sealed the deal for me. And the way they present these stages and states from a Jungian perspective is a journey of separation. And I'll show you what I mean by that. Here we go. So the infant is, being born, separating from the mother. If you're a little tiny infant that's partially developed, you've separated from the creator, let's say it, God. Mom is God. She created you, and you're separating from that. In the second stage, you're separating from the mother or the parents. You begin walking, talking, saying no. Any parent knows there's this huge separation from the mother and the parents. And the third stage, as you can see with Erikson and Freeman, maybe they get away from this symbolic conceptual language realm that a lot of us from Wilson's world, Robert Anton Wilson's world, are familiar with. But Jung brings us back to that, and he calls it the separation of the world parents. So we're not talking about separation from the world parents. We're talking about separation of the world parents. And the way I understand that is the infant and the toddler, basically they're saying, especially the toddler is saying mom and dad is kind of like one entity. And in this preschool stage, it's kind of like he's been then able to separate the parents from one entity to 2, mom and dad. And the way I see this is this is the first symbol where this is duality. We're going from mom and dad to mom and dad. It's a creation of duality. And that is, the duality is the birth of symbolism, and symbolism complexifies into concepts. So again, we're talking about this symbolic conceptual circuit. So we're back to that with Jung. And then finally, again, Jung kind of is in agreement here that he doesn't really address this latency stage. And he moves on, and really we're talking about the adolescent, where we're separating from the family of origin. You know, you're moving from dependence on the family to going out in the world on your own. And so those being the 4 stages, and I think this whole thing of separation is kind of come back to us when we talk about the upper circuits, because I believe the upper circuits are a journey of reunification, a journey of separation on the lower and a journey of reunification on the upper. And we'll get to that next time, or whenever I get to the upper circuits, but just throwing that out there. So again, this really just, when I got Jung through this Neumann perspective, I was like, oh, this is the real deal. Jung's on board with us here on these 4 lower circuits. And that kind of summarizes these psychological developmental models. And I'm going to move into more neuroscience and structures of the brain. In Prometheus Rising, Robert Anton Wilson actually discusses this McLean model called the Triune brain. He calls it, strangely, the Sagan model. Maybe Sagan was promoting it. I'm not quite sure why he calls it that. But it divides this brain into the reptilian brain, the limbic brain, and the neocortex. And when you start really looking at the reptilian brain, it's like, this is a pretty damn good analog for the first dimension of physical consciousness. That reptile brain is like seeking nourishment or retreating for danger. And we start looking at the limbic brain. It's a pretty damn okay analog for the second dimension of emotions. And on the surface, the neocortex, as a rational or thinking brain, is a pretty good analog for the third dimension, the symbolic conceptual mind. But what about the fourth dimension? Well, lo and behold, it really, the neocortex, McLean doesn't address this, but the neocortex really should be divided up to this front portion here, the prefrontal cortex. That is the most recently evolved structure of the brain. And you could say that is really the most human part of the brain, but it is the most recently evolved. So if we split out the neocortex into the prefrontal and the rest of it, we could have, therefore, a fourth dimension. And that's, this is cute, and I'd say it works about 75% of the time. But I just caution us all about connecting directly and saying the reptilian brain is the first dimension. I think we can look at the reptilian brain and study it and use that to inform our definition of the first dimension, but we don't want to connect these things apples to apples. And in fact, what we find is it gets messy. These are complex structures, and it just gets messy. The prefrontal cortex, some of it develops during toddlerhood. And in fact, Robert Sapolsky, a brilliant neuroscientist, considers the prefrontal cortex to be a part of the limbic system itself. And so there's sort of a second dimension aspect if we use this model in that way. And in fact, that actually fits really well, whereas the prefrontal cortex goes through another growth spurt during adolescence. So maybe that's part of the prefrontal cortex we ascribe to the fourth dimension, adolescence. We would just want to hold these concepts lightly and use them to inform our definition. And this take a moment to just say, everybody's going to come up with their own definition of the model. I'm presenting, after 25 years of study, what I believe to be a very elegant and fairly scientifically accurate version of the model based on all this stuff. Now here, I'll throw a wrench in this. During the 60s and 70s, it was really vogue to talk about the right brain versus the left brain, and that kind of rational, concrete versus the creative, intuitive. And then that was all largely debunked, and it actually kind of became taboo to talk about left versus right hemisphere in serious scientific circles. And it still is today. Psychology is really slow and archaic in the way it changes. It's crazy. People hold on to their ideas. But anyway, a guy has come around now, Iain McGilchrist, and he has some wonderful book on brain lateralization called The Master and His Emissary. There's also a film on this called The Divided Brain that I believe you can get I haven't watched it, but you could get it through Amazon. Anyhow, he really does a whole in-depth study on the differences between the right and the left hemisphere. And when I read this, I start to see how the right hemisphere correlates with the second dimension and the left hemisphere correlates with the third dimension. And I start to use that to inform my definitions of the third and second dimensions. Meanwhile, Alan Shore really, he focuses mostly on the right hemisphere as emotional regulation. And that, again, feeds kind of into the idea that the right hemisphere is a second dimension thing there, or something that we can use to inform our definitions of the second dimension. Curiously, Iain McGilchrist calls his book The Master and His Emissary. And as I interpret that, that's an allusion to the right hemisphere, the second dimension usually running the show, and the third dimension, language, for example, speaking about the show, being able to communicate, the emissary, the messenger, so to speak. And the funny thing is the messenger often gets confused and thinks he's in charge when he's really just the messenger. And I think as we explore the third dimension, I really feel like the third dimension is the trickster. It's like the hidden dimension that we don't realize how much bias is built into our own belief systems and the language we use. And so I just love that little thing there about the master and his emissary that Iain presents, and how that fits with my interpretation of second and third dimension. And again, this kind of throws a wrench in our more linear hierarchical view here of reptile limbic neocortex, because we're talking right and left instead of this, linear hierarchy, so to speak. But again, using both perspectives to inform our definition of the dimensions. So all that said, in summary here, we've got kind of these 5 stages, but of what I'm going to call 4 states, kind of neglecting this assimilation period of the grade schooler. And we've got these really elegant questions from Duey Freemen. Is the world okay? Am I okay? Who am I? We've got this neat little model of evolution of consciousness in Jung's journey of separation. And all these neuroscience aspects that we look at, that as I go in the next 4 installments of this series, we'll be going in depth into each of the 4 lower dimensions. And so with the first dimension, we're going to start talking about attachment theory, the reptile system, that's the R system, polyvagal theory, and the amygdala. With this second dimension, we'll talk about emotional systems, emotional regulation, the limbic system, and the right prefrontal cortex. And with the third dimension, we get into general semantics, theory of mind, the left prefrontal cortex, and the left hemisphere in general. And meanwhile, the fourth dimension of the adolescent, I'm going to imply some stuff from Dan Siegel and his intersubjective neurobiology. Really, all of this is intersubjective neurobiology in my world. But we talk about cortical pruning and myelination processes. Dan refers to that as integration and differentiation, and the prefrontal cortex in general. Boom. So that's that. That's kind of my overview for these 4 dimensions based on 4 developmental stages that are informing our definition of 4 dimensions of mind. Again, as the way I envision it right now is the next 4 weeks or 4 episodes will be on the in-depth on the 4 lower dimensions, and then probably cap it off with the episode on the upper dimensions, and then start going into Chapel Perilous and the hero's journey and how we put it all together. So anyhow, if you've been following along, thank you. This is me kind of, it's helpful for me to do this to help force me to figure my shit out. And to the extent you're following along and listening, enjoying, thank you.